President Trump's foreign policy in 2025 has been characterized by a year of disruption. And this was evident from the very early days of his presidency when he dismantled the United States main development agency, USAID. And it carried forward through all manner of policy. We saw April 2nd, so-called Liberation Day, in which the president levied historically high tariffs, not just on U.S. competitors, but also on allies and partners, and inaugurated a roller coaster trade war that continues even to this day. And so part of this is the emergence of a new brand of American foreign policy, and I think we can call it a MAGA foreign policy. And we saw this, I think, expressed most clearly in the recently released National Security Strategy, which is the first MAGA national security strategy. It's one that really sets aside the first Trump administration's focus on great power competition with China and Russia in favor of a much more ideological worldview. One that leads the Washington establishment today to focus, number one, on the Western Hemisphere. So looking ahead to 2026, here are my top 3 things to watch. Number 1, what happens with all the U.S. forces that are massed in the Caribbean? Do they ultimately undertake some military action in Venezuela? Does it work? What is the future of the Maduro regime there, and how does President Trump take forward this policy? Because he has raised the stakes quite significantly, and yet President Maduro still has not left. The question for 2026 and beyond is there going to be a crisis where the United States is called upon to actually act on its Article 5 responsibilities to defend its allies, and what does it do if that happens? So that could look like stepped up Russian incursions into NATO territory, that could look like Chinese action or aggression against Japan, for example, or even the Philippines. And that will really call the question of to what extent does the United States under President Trump still live up to its treaty obligations? The third big story to watch in 2026 is the future of the US-China relationship. We expect that there will be reciprocal visits. President Trump will go to China and President Xi will come to the United States over the course of 2026 if the current diplomacy remains on track. My question is, what's going to be agreed at those meetings? What kind of commercial truce might Presidents Trump and Xi seek, and at what cost? I'm particularly concerned about what President Trump might give up in other strategic areas having to do with AI, having to do with Taiwan, having to do with U.S. allies in the Indo-Pacific in exchange for a trade deal with President Xi that seems favorable. What we see in the Trump administration is a lot of focus on the shiny deal making, the signing ceremonies, the conclusions of these flashy diplomatic deals. And those can be consequential. But what we don't see is the follow through. What we don't see is the focus on execution and implementation and the granular details that really make the difference between a stable peace and a very unshaky truce or even a return to war. And the part of the problem is that the Trump administration simply just doesn't have the team to do it. They have fired many civil servants. They have excluded civil servants and deep expertise within the US government from being a part of their processes. They've basically taken apart the National Security Council at the White House, which would usually oversee the interagency process that drives forward these types of agreements. And they've put so much weight in these individual diplomats, people like Steve Witkoff, who only have so many hours of the day. And so when he's focusing, for example, on Ukraine, he's not focusing on implementation of Gaza. And without a broader and deeper team that draws on the full expertise of the US government, you're just not going to see these deals turn into the kind of lasting peace that might, in the end, warrant a Nobel Peace Prize. The fundamental points of failure, I believe, in President Trump's Ukraine policy are that he misunderstands Russian President Vladimir Putin and his motivations. And so even in those times when President Trump has been willing to exert extraordinary pressure on the United States Ukrainian partners, think back to that Oval Office meeting in which President Trump berated President Zelensky in front of the press. Nevertheless, there has not been a resolution to the conflict. And the reason is that President Putin has not yet wanted the war to end. He still sees more benefit in continuing the fighting. And in part, that's because at the end of the day, Putin thinks that Trump is not on the Ukrainian side. So if he can just hold on long enough, eventually he believes President Trump will abandon Ukraine and Russia will be able to get a settlement of the war that is more favorable than anything it can negotiate diplomatically.
I mean, 2025 has been a year that's been in many ways defined by increasing security instability and actual conflict. And I think we can see really the confluence of three major trends across the year and looking into 2026. One has been this long-term trend, which has been a move away from the peace and stability that defined the period from the 1980s up until the Arab Spring, when we saw a long-term decline in the number of wars and number of people killed in wars, in the duration of war. And then from the Arab Spring, that began to change. We started to see more wars emerging. And 2024 was the highest number of state-to-state wars since the end of World War II. So this has been a really sort of global trend. And underpinning this is really been the end of Pax America and the relative decline of the US and the role of the US as a policeman, and sort of backing a whole process of peace initiatives, mostly through the UN. The second one we've seen is, I think, stemming from the first one, is a growing fragmentation across regions, more and more regional conflicts. The Middle East, of course, the European one in Ukraine, conflicts across Africa. We've seen Asia now. We saw the India-Pakistan confrontation, the Cambodia-Taiwan, Myanmar, ongoing conflict there, and other forms of violence in Latin America. We've got more and more organized crime groups. And then lastly, I think what you can see is the very worrying trend, which is all of this is starting to bring the major powers into more direct confrontation. More and more talk we hear about the possibility of a European-Russia war. Just this week, we've had the Secretary General of NATO saying that there's a high possibility that in the next 4 to 5 years of a direct conflict. The US-China conflict, I mean, it's continuing militarization of these key regions. So this is the really sort of worrying movement now, I think, that we see playing out in different regional theaters, but also at the global. But I mean, one other issue is that we are seeing a big return to weapons of mass destruction. We're seeing a nuclear sort of renaissance in terms of the big powers looking at nuclear weapons, increasing their numbers, China looking to build up to match Russia and the US in terms of numbers, new kinds of systems coming online. So all of these things are reinforcing a sense of insecurity that's likely to run through the next year.
I think what happens for China in 2025 was about how China managed Donald Trump and the challenges that the first year of the Trump administration threw up. And the Chinese would be feeling quite smug about it, that they have handled Trump very well. And when Trump went on the attack, the Chinese held their ground and effectively forced Donald Trump to back off in a way that really does not harm China's overall interests. And that was something that I think they would consider as a major achievement. At the moment, I would pay a fair bit of attention to the China-Japan relationship. I think the Chinese government really do need to find ways to ease tensions with Japan, because China-Japan relationship is inherently a very emotional one in China anyway, even without the recent dispute with the Prime Minister over Taiwan. The Chinese populations have been brought up with a diet of anti-Japanese sentiments, with wartime China-Japan, Japanese atrocities in China being constantly replayed on this TV screen, getting people very emotional about Japan. So if the Chinese government does not ease that tension, the relationship is going to get very much more difficult. And the economic consequences will be there. And the risk of something happening is much higher. We already seen a very, very rough outline of what the 5-year plan, the 15 5-year plan will look like when the Communist Party had its fourth plenum back in November. The outline essentially is one of China doubling down in the approaches that it has already taken. It focuses on the advancing the economy in terms of its more cutting-edge, innovative side, and therefore China becoming a leader in some fields of technology, setting the international norms and standards, and exporting them to countries in the global south or indeed elsewhere if they are receptive. So a lot of the basic problems that the Chinese government faces, like local level government debts, like the collapsed property market, like the enormous scale of youth unemployment, like the productivity gap, like the risk of being caught in a middle income trap. Now, those problems at the moment do not appear to have been tackled with what we know of the skeleton structure of the next 5-year plan.
Quite devastating. So, I mean, the year started with the really large LA fires, and across the year, the devastating heat waves in Europe, where a lot of elderly people died, and most recently Hurricane Melissa that hit Jamaica and eastern Cuba, a really large Category 5 hurricane that created a lot of negative impacts on small islands, made landfall. So it's a bit as we were expecting to see with increasing climate change. We're seeing more intense and more frequent extreme weather events that negatively affect our societies. Yeah, so as long as we keep burning fossil fuels, oil, gas and coal, these extreme weather events will become worse, both more intense and more frequent. And so the good news is that in 2026, if we adapt more, if we implement more adaptive measures, prepare better, we can avoid some of these impacts. But it's also necessary to reduce emissions to make sure that these events don't become worse, because there are also limits to adaptation. So I think also we experienced events where there were signs that no matter how prepared you are, it's really hard to avoid some of these negative impacts.
So I think 2025 was the year when people began to realize that just investing more in data centers and compute is not going to do the job. And so in this year, we've seen a two-speed economy. We've seen a lot of resources and investment going into artificial intelligence. We're seeing gains in the stock market, largely driven by AI-related companies. Investors are now beginning to ask questions about the returns, about how these extraordinary amounts of capital flowing in to AI will generate a return, especially because business use of AI, according to different surveys, has actually been falling since the summer. So you have record levels of investment going in, you have fewer users coming out. Most growth and prosperity comes from doing new and previously inconceivable things, not just automating existing work. And right now, basically every application of AI I can think of is about process improvements and automation, not product development. And in addition to that, a key question is then, might AI lead to an upsurge in scientific discovery, which is one of the key hopes out there, that AI becomes a method of invention. So in 2025, we saw for the first time AI having a material impact on the labor market, and particularly on the job prospects of new graduates. I think in 2026, it's likely that we will see more of that, and a wider range of occupations being affected. And the reason for that is that what AI does is essentially reducing barriers to entry. It is making knowledge work easier across the board. So right now, AI adoption is stagnant and even falling by some measures. And so the question is, will 2026 be the year that this trend continues, or will we see an uptake in new use cases? And the second question is, will firms investing in AI be able to make a return on those investments, which is not the same as the first question, because it's absolutely possible for AI to be a wonderful technology, just like airlines, but also be an unprofitable industry because of vigorous competition. And we're now seeing very vigorous competition, especially from open source models developed in China, which are likely to push down returns. And so the question is, will 2026 be the year of the AI bust in financial terms? And what then happens to the technology if then the bubble burst?